America, the nation of prosperity, filled with its dreams and hope. The United States has come a long way from its start, but it hasn't always been like that. They have worked hard to get where they are. They had obstacles left and right, especially when regarding the Cold War, a war so complicated and filled with so much fear that it created a whole new generation.
The United States' relationship with communist countries was on the edge, especially with the Soviet Union. After the atomic bomb, other countries realized that they should also acquire weapons similar to that one. Just 6 months after the United Nations General Assembly, the United States conducted its first post-war nuclear test called Operation Crossroads. At the same time, the Soviet government was also working on its own atomic weapons, detonating its first bomb on August 29, 1949. This shocked the entire world. They also introduced the intercontinental ballistic missiles, also known as ICBMs. The fear of a third world war, even worse, a nuclear war, was born. On June 25, 1950, the Korean War became the first military action of the Cold War. It started when 75,000 soldiers from the North Korean People's Army poured across the boundary between the Democratic People's Republic of Korea and the Republic of Korea to the south. The North was supported by the Soviets, while the South had more pro-Western views. By July, American troops had entered the war on South Korea's behalf. The National Security Council report, known as NSC 68, also recommended that the United States use military force to contain communist expansionism anywhere it seemed to be occurring, regardless of the intrinsic, strategic, or economic value of the land in question. Even though the Korean War was relatively short, it was very bloody, causing nearly 5 million casualties, with more than half of these being civilians. However, it wasn't the most controversial war during this time. When Vietnam declared itself independent from France in 1950 with the support from People's Republic of China, neither the United States nor France acknowledged this. In 1964, President Lyndon B. Johnson asked Congress for the power to go to war against the North Vietnamese and the Communists for violating the Geneva Accord against South Vietnam and Laos, and his request was granted. The bombing of North Vietnam surpassed the total tonnage of bombs dropped on Germany, Italy, and Japan in World War II. The divisive war, increasingly unpopular back in the States, ended with the withdrawal of U.S. forces in 1973 and the unification of Vietnam under communist control 2 years later. More than 3 million people, including 58,000 Americans, were killed in the conflict. Back in the United States, people were fearing a nuclear war. The fear was so intense, they started to create prevention strategies. The most common and impactful of them all was the duck and cover strategy. It was a method taught in American schools from the early 1950s until late 1980s, as to inform people and protect them against any unexpected nuclear attacks.
Be sure and remember what Bert the Turtle just did, friends, because every one of us must remember to do the same thing.
Up to this day, similar advices are given to areas prone to earthquakes and tornadoes. The other main strategy used for prevention of nuclear war was the creation of the agreement between the United States of America and the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics on the prevention of nuclear war. It was signed on June 22, 1973, and entered into force on that same day. The fear of communism in the United States did not start during the Cold War, but in reality started during the 1920s. It was called the Red Scare, and it was so intense it caused conflict with its own citizen rights. People like Charlie Chaplin, John Dewey, and Felix Frankfurt were accused of supporting communism. People started to fear expressing their ideas. The government started distrusting foreigners, and there were a lot of organized labor movements. Since the strikes were harming the country economically, President Wilson told the workers that they could strike once more, and when World War I was over, they would get better payment and better working conditions. Americans started to blame the labor unions of the country's economic problems and launched the campaign known as the Red Scare that would protect them from the Reds. However, this didn't last long and soon died, only to revive years later. The communist hunt was similar to the witch hunt of Salem, because they were always pointing fingers without knowing for certain, but everyone believed it anyway.
The farm vote will put a stop to this.
Farmers don't vote anymore.
What'll I do for seed next year?
You won't have to worry about next year. The state will do your planning from now on.
But it wasn't just America that feared the communists. In the Soviet Union, they had propaganda against capitalism in America.
Стоп! Остановим руку эту! Народ истории дворец! Любых врагов страны Советов и их гадалок ждет конец!
The USA and the USSR used spies to get knowledge of what was going on in the other side. Though the US used mainly people from the United States, the USSR also hired Britain people to spy in Britain. The most famous Britain people that didn't support their government and were willing to help the USSR were the Cambridge Five, which were high-class people that got into high positions in the English establishment. In 1971, British intelligence announced that 120 Soviet intelligence officers were operating in Britain.
In America, the OSS job was to collect foreign intelligence that allowed American troops to know how and where to act all over Europe and the Pacific. However, the OSS was not permitted to control all the affairs, so it remained as secret as possible. Franklin D. Roosevelt didn't support the OSS because he thought they were poorly skilled and ill-mannered, so later he dismantled it, but William J. Donovan, the leader, proposed a new plan. Through amending the initial plan and with help of the FBI, Truman created the Central Intelligence Group and the National Intelligence Authority in 1946.
In the early Cold War, only 9% of Americans that attended to school graduated from high school. Children in primary schools were taught that communism was bad, yet they didn't precisely say what communism was. Books, such as Robin Hood's, were banned from schools because the government thought it could create controversy. The government invested tons of money in education, making lower and higher education be free and mandatory. The purpose was to win the Cold War, by teaching students that getting a good education was a patriotic need to help win the Communist War. The National Defense Education Act was passed in 1958. Its purpose was to help ensure that highly trained individuals will be available to help Americans compete with the Soviet Union in scientific and technical fields. The Americans were looking for answers of communists in Washington because communists took almost all Asia and a big part in Europe. There were a lot of international cooperations among the free world nations, military reorganization, and in the US, the civil defense was in charge of keeping citizens safe. A lot of distrust was built up in the US, basically in Washington, D.C., with fear of a communist government.
Lifestyle in the United States started to change for some people since now, submariners and their families had to adapt to the submarine's new lifestyle during the Cold War. Since there was an increase in the number of the military, such as the Navy, the submariners moved their family with them to the bases so they could still live together. At the bases, life was very restricted, private, and structured, having to follow the base's rules.
The federal government started having more fear when communists started spreading. Congress launched an investigation of communist influence in Hollywood and laws banning communists from teaching positions in many states. Truman's loyalty program resulted in the discovery of only few employees whose loyalty could be reasonably doubted. Senator Joseph McCarthy did some accusations that there were communists holding prominent positions in the US. He accused many people from the Republican Party and low-level officials. McCarthy proclaimed that he was aware of 205 card-carrying members of the Communist Party who worked for the United States Department of State. His speech set off an era of paranoia and accusation and propelled McCarthy into the national spotlight. Communism was taking over Hollywood and showing a bad side of the US, affecting its reputation worldwide. People who were considered un-American were blacklisted. The president of motion picture, Eric Johnson, pled that he will never be considered as an un-American along with other producers. Nearly 60% of all individuals called to testify and an equal percent of all those blacklisted were screenwriters. Only 20% of those and 25% of other blacklisted were actors.